Los Angeles knows how to hide shit. Not just behind palm trees and movie sets, not just behind sirens in the distance and helicopters cutting circles over the dark. It hides shit in plain sight. In side streets, alleyways, neighborhoods the cities love to use, but hate to see. And for years in South Los Angeles, something evil moved throughout the darkness almost unchallenged. Women disappeared, bodies were found. Families were left with questions that seemed to bounce off concrete and die in the air. The pattern was there. The fear was there. The dead were definitely there. So why did it take so long? How does a man prey on women for decades in one of the biggest cities in America while the world barely seemed to notice? This is not just a story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., the man later convicted of murdering 10 people and attempting to murder another in crimes stretching from the mid-1980s to 2007. This is also the story of neglect, of silence, of a system that seemed to treat some victims like they belonged in the margins. Because the most disturbing part of the Grim Sleeper case is not only that a killer may have hidden in plain sight, it is that for a long time, the city pretty much helped him stay there. Now, to truly understand the Grim Sleeper case, you gotta understand the ground it grew in. South LA was not some abstract crime map on the evening news. It was a real place where real shit went down. Mothers, daughters, workers, dreamers, addicts, survivors. People trying to get through the week with a little dignity left in their pocket. But like too many black neighborhoods in America, it was often seen by institutions through a dirty-ass lens. Not as a community under pressure, but as a place already written off. And that matters here. Because when the women targeted in this case were described mainly through addiction, sex work, poverty, or vulnerability, those labels did not just describe risk. They shaped the response. They shaped the urgency. They shaped who got sympathy and who got filed away. That is not speculation dressed up as poetry. It is the shadow hanging over this entire case. The official record shows a long series of murders in South Los Angeles spanning roughly 1985 to 2007, with victims who were primarily black women and girls. The emotional reality is harder to stamp into paperwork. A lot of people felt these women were not protected the way others might have been. And then there's the name, the Grim Sleeper. A nickname built around an apparent 14-year gap between murders, from 88 to 2002. A name that almost sounds cinematic until you remember what it really means. It means these bodies stopped for a while. It means the fear changed shape. It means the case went cold enough for mythology to creep in. But no matter how famous the nickname became, the story was never supposed to be about branding a monster. It was always supposed to be about the women, the victims. See, what fucked me up the most about this is that Lonnie David Franklin Jr. did not look like some final boss in a horror movie by any stretch of the imagination. That's what makes this case so unsettling to me. The public often imagines evil with neon signs around it. Something loud, something theatrical, something that announces itself. But many of the most chilling people in criminal history did not arrive with thunder. They arrived looking ordinary enough to disappear into routine. Official accounts identify Franklin as a South Los Angeles man born in 1952 who was arrested in July 2010 at age 57. Authorities said he was taken into custody by LAPD robbery homicide detectives after an investigation that had spanned and intensified over several years. By then, the police believed he was connected to at least 10 murders in South Los Angeles spanning more than 2 decades. And that's the first hard truth this case forces you to sit with. For decades, the man prosecutors were later convicted of these murders was not hiding in some cave. He was smack dab in the middle of South Central, in the hood, around people, around routines, around life. And that kind of proximity creates a different kind of dread. Not the dread of some kind of phantom or, enigma. The dread of a man who could fold himself into the background so completely that suspicion did not harden into consequence for years. So what does it mean when someone can move like that through a community already carrying enough weight? What does it say about the limits of instinct, rumor, police work, or public attention? It says this: Evil does not always announce itself. Every serial murder case has geography. This one has atmosphere. The crimes tied to Franklin unfolded in South Los Angeles, and the official descriptions of the case repeatedly root the murders there. But the map alone is not enough. You have to feel the social weather. You have to understand the neighborhoods not just as scenery, but as terrain shaped by neglect, over-policing in some ways and under-protection in others, and the brutal arithmetic of vulnerability. See, many of the victims were Black women living hard lives at the edge of public concern. Some struggled with addiction. Some were involved in street economies. Too often in America, that becomes a quiet excuse for indifference. The danger does not lessen, but the search does. The grief doesn't shrink, the coverage does. And that's the rot at the center of the story. Because predators notice hierarchy, just like we do. They notice who gets headlines, who gets search parties, who gets the full weight of public empathy, and who get a shrug wrapped in bureaucracy. If the city teaches over and over that some women are disposable, sooner or later, somebody monstrous will decide to test that lesson. So, was South LA abandoned by everyone? Nah. Families cared. Neighbors cared. Community members carried memory when institutions dragged their feet. But that is exactly what makes this story sting the most. Concern existed. Pain existed. Fear existed. Yet the machinery that should have moved faster often seemed to grind in place. And in that stalled machinery, the killer found wiggle room.
For anxious decades, the Grim Sleeper haunted the streets of South Los Angeles. Police say the serial murderer was responsible for at least 10 deaths between 1985 and 2007, mostly African-American women.
The early years of the Grim Sleeper case feel like a warning siren no one fully acknowledged. According to the conviction announcement from the Los Angeles County District Attorney, Franklin was found guilty of killing 10 young women and girls over a 22-year period, and of one attempted murder. LAPD's account similarly traces the murders connected to the case to the years between 1985 and 2007 in South Los Angeles. The women's bodies were often left in alleyways, dumpsters, or other exposed places, discarded with cruelty that was both physical and symbolic. That matters, because disposal is a message. It says something about how the killer saw the victims, but it also forces a second question that is even harder to swallow. What did the city's response say about how these women were seen by everybody else? The pattern investigators eventually described was not random. Prosecutors and police said the victims were linked by forensic evidence and by recurring case similarities across the years. There was also one known survivor, a woman whose survival gave investigators an account that helped sharpen the shape of the threat. Franklin was ultimately convicted not only of the murders, but of attempted first-degree murder as well. Still, a pattern on paper is not the same thing as urgency in practice. And that's where the silence turns toxic. Because once bodies begin appearing in ways that echo each other, once lives are ending inside a recognizable pattern, once entire neighborhoods begin carrying the low hum of rumor and dread, the clock should start screaming. But in this case, the clock seemed to tick underwater. Here's where the script has to stop being polite. This case was not stretched across decades by the killer alone. It was stretched by the conditions around him. The victims in the Grim Sleeper case were overwhelmingly Black women and girls from South Los Angeles. And that's not a side note. You're not pushing that shit to the side. That is the beating moral center of the story. If these had been women from wealthier neighborhoods, women with more institutional visibility, women whose names the media considered immediately marketable, would the pace have been the same? Would the silence have lasted this long? The public record cannot answer that with perfect math, but the question hangs over this case for a motherfucking reason. Institutional neglect is not always a man slamming a door in your face. Sometimes it's much slower. It looks like not enough coverage, not enough pressure, Not enough coordinated urgency. It looks like the dead being flattened into a lifestyle narrative instead of being censored as human beings. It looks like a culture so used to Black suffering that another murdered woman in South LA does not trigger national shock, but only local grief. And media indifference has its own body count. Because cameras decide who becomes legible. Headlines decide whose name reaches strangers. Silence, repeated long enough, becomes permission. Not legal permission, social permission. A fog in which accountability loses its luster and its outline. So yes, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was ultimately convicted by a jury of his peers. But the system that finally cornered him is not innocent just because it arrived eventually. When a major city allows years of warning signs to pile up around vulnerable women before the full moral force of the state locks in, that is not merely just a delay. That is fucking failure with their fingerprints all over it. The nickname Grim Sleeper was coined because investigators believed there was an apparent 14-year break in the killings, from '88 until 2002. That gap became one of the most infamous features of the case. It fed public fascination. It helped create the idea of a killer who simply went dormant and then returned. But even that name carries a trap. It can make the case sound like a legend, like folklore, like the killer disappeared into some supernatural fog and then woke back up when the script demanded it. Real life is a lot uglier than that. Maybe there was a true gap. Maybe the available evidence only marks a gap in what could be proven. Maybe some victims were never linked. The existence of more than 100, later described as 180 photographs of women found in Franklin's possession is part of why that uncertainty remains so disturbing. Police did not release those images for drama. They released them because detectives feared some women in those photos might never have been identified at all. So when people say he slept, the better question may be, slept from what? Killing? From protection? From the version of the story that authorities could conclusively prove? That uncertainty is its own kind of nightmare. Because a gap in evidence is not always a gap in harm. This is the part many true crime stories fail. They spend all their language on the killer, then toss the victims a paragraph like spare change. Not here. The women in this case were not just plot devices. They were not vulnerable women in police shorthand. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, women with inside jokes, old school pictures, habits, scars, favorite songs, people who had survived more than the public ever cared to ask about. LAPD's later effort to identify scores of women found in photographs connected to Franklin was disturbing precisely because each face represented a life, a history, a family, a web of memory that could not be reduced to evidence tags. And the known victims deserve to be spoken of with that same dignity. Not as bodies discovered, not as cautionary tales, not as high-risk lifestyle, as people. That is also why the dehumanization around the case cuts so deep. When public narratives lead with addiction, survival, sex, or neighborhood stigma before they lead with personhood, the victims are robbed twice. First by violence, then by framing. It is easy, decades later, to speak so solemnly and pretend everyone cared equally all along. But if that were true, this story would not feel the way it does. It wouldn't have this ache inside of it. It wouldn't carry this bitter aftertaste of women being left in the dark while systems debated how bright the flashlight should be. A victim-centered telling does not mean avoiding the horror. It means assigning it correctly. The horror is not only what was done to them, but how easily the world learned to step around it. By the time Franklin was arrested in July 2010, LAPD described the case as a culmination of an exhaustive task force investigation that had been underway for more than 3 years. That wording matters because it tells you two things at once. First, the investigators eventually did commit serious resources. Second, the case had already sat in the shadows for a very long time before that momentum fully arrived. The long arc of the case exposed not just how hard serial investigations can be, but how badly those difficulties compound when victims sit at the intersection of race, poverty, stigma, and public invisibility. Families and community members had to live with that compromising and compounding silence. Every year without closure became its own wound. Every fresh revelation reopened the old ones. And then there was the courtroom. When trial testimony and graphic evidence finally began surfacing publicly in 2016, reports described family members weeping, leaving the courtroom, trembling under the weight of what they were forced to relive decades after the killings began. The justice system finally spoke with volume, but by then the emotional bill had been collecting interest for years. This is where the phrase cold case starts to sound dishonest. There was nothing cold about it for the families. Nothing cold about years of not knowing. Nothing cold about walking past alleyways and wondering what the city misses when it decides not to look closely. What failed here was not only technology, procedure, or timing. What failed here was moral imagination. The ability to recognize early and loudly that these women deserve the same force of outrage the country instantly finds for victims it sees as more respectable. For all the darkness in this story, the break in the case came through something precise: science. In 2010, California officials announced that the state's familial DNA search program had helped identify the suspect in the Grim Sleeper case. According to the California Department of Justice, the program connected crime scene DNA to a relative in the database, which then led investigators to Franklin. Attorney General Jerry Brown's office called the use of familial DNA in the case groundbreaking and controversial, but also pivotal to the arrest. That forensic breakthrough deserves to be explained plainly because it changed the trajectory of the case. A direct match had apparently not materialized in the database. So instead, investigators used familial DNA searching, looking for close biological relationships to the unknown offender profile. That method pointed them forward, towards Franklin's family line. From there, authorities zeroed in on him. Soon after, the LAPD announced that Franklin had been taken into custody, tying the arrest to exhaustive investigation and a broader breakthrough in the case. There's something eerie about that moment. A killer who had lived for years inside the blind spots of the city was not finally exposed by a confession, a dramatic chase, or some cinematic stumble. He was exposed by relation, by trace, by the mathematics of blood. The case cracked not because the darkness volunteered an answer, but because science kept pressing until darkness gave up one. And even there, the story stays complicated. Familial DNA searching has sparked civil liberty debates and legal controversy. But in this case, officials credited it with directly identifying the suspect in a murder series that had haunted South Los Angeles for decades. Then came one of the most chilling turns in the entire case. After Franklin's arrest, investigators found a large collection of photographs in his possession. LAPD initially said more than 100 photographs had been discovered and asked for the public to help them put names to faces. Days later, the department updated that number publicly, saying 180 images had been posted online and that detectives were receiving calls from the public. Reuters similarly reported that police feared some of the women and girls depicted could be among unidentified victims. Sit with that for a second. A stack of faces, a gallery of women, a visual archive of contact, control, encounter, memory, maybe even violence, maybe even survival, maybe something worse that no document can fully retrieve. This is where the Grim Sleeper case stops being only about the murders proven in courts and starts brushing against a larger field of dread. Not because every photograph proves a crime. It does not. Authorities themselves sought identification rather than making blanketed claims. But the scale of the collection raised an awful possibility. How many stories had crossed this man's path without ever making it into the case file? that the world would see. That is why the photos remain so haunting. Not because they're mysterious in a tabloid sense, but because they are so ordinary. Smiles, poses, human beings caught in a frame, each one carrying a life beyond the borders of that picture. And once you realize that some may have never been properly identified, the images start to feel less like evidence and more like a hallway lined with unfinished prayers. Franklin's arrest came in July 2010. His trial began years later, and in May 2016, a Los Angeles jury found him guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, tied to the Los Angeles killings. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office said that the murders covered a 22-year period, and LAPD said the jury deliberated briefly before returning guilty verdicts. That verdict mattered. It mattered because it finally attached legal consequence to a nightmare that had lingered over the city for decades. It mattered because families who had carried grief through multiple eras of Los Angeles history were finally able to hear a jury say, in the blunt language of the law, that the man accused had been found responsible, legally. A few months later, in August 2016, Franklin was sentenced to death, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The office said more than 15 family members spoke in court about the pain of losing their loved ones. But even here, closure feels like the wrong word, right? What do you close, exactly? A family photo with one person missing forever? A childhood nickname nobody gets to ever hear again? A mother's aging face after decades of waiting? The verdict was justice in the legal sense. Necessary, significant, hard-won. But justice after that much delay does not feel clean. It feels heavy. It feels late. It feels like a city trying to answer for years it can never give back. The Grim Sleeper case exposed the serial killer, but it also exposed the hierarchy of visibility. It revealed, with brutal clarity, some victims in America can disappear into a kind of civic dimness, where the full machinery of outrage does not immediately activate. The official record tells us Franklin was convicted of murders committed over decades. The moral record tells us something larger. Women targeted in this case were living at the crossroads of race, gender, poverty, addiction stigma, and institutional neglect. And those crossroads can become deadly when society starts reading vulnerability as expendability. This is why the case still burns. Not because the killer was uniquely theatrical, not because the nickname was memorable, not because true crime culture found another dark chapter to obsess over. It burns because the story feels so familiar. A community says something is wrong, women are endangered, bodies accumulate. The response drags. Then years later, everyone all of a sudden discovers the tragedy that was already there. That pattern is bigger than one man. And if this case means anything beyond its verdict, it is this. The measure of a society is not how eloquently it mourns once the cameras arrive. It is how urgently it protects people before they become a press conference. End. The Grim Sleeper was not just one man's fall. It was the slow collapse of a silence that hung over South Los Angeles for years. A silence that wrapped itself around women the world found too easy to overlook. A silence that let grief age in place. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was ultimately arrested, tried, and convicted. The record says the system got there. The families know how long there took. And maybe that is the last disturbing truth this case leaves behind. Justice did arrive, but it arrived after too much had already been buried. So when people remember the Grim Sleeper, they should not remember a nickname first. They should remember the victims. The women whose names deserved louder protection. The women whose disappearances should have shaken the city way sooner. The women whose lives were full, even when the world insisted on reducing them to danger, vice, or evidence. Because the darker part of this story was never just the killer. It was the ease with which a society can be taught not to flinch. And if that lesson remains intact, if the same neighborhoods can still be ignored, if the same women can still be written off as background noise in their own lives, then the case is not really over at all. It is just quiet again.